Benchwarmer Barbie. That's what they scribbled on her locker nameplate, just because she was the only female officer who'd never been allowed to sit at the aircraft launch control panel. But on that day, when an FA-18 lost control over choppy seas and nobody knew how to handle that ancient backup system, she stepped forward, entered the code in 6 seconds flat, and saved a pilot from plunging into the ocean. Valerie Langford, 26 years old, graduated top of her class in aircraft launch systems engineering, assigned to the USS Roosevelt aircraft carrier. Despite her stellar credentials, she was placed on the launch support team. Her job? Cleaning equipment, checking pneumatic pressure, and serving the lead engineers. Her teammates, mostly men, called her Benchwarmer Barbie. Half joking, half dismissive. The doll knows how to polish the guns, but not strong enough to fire them. Someone even stuck a label on her locker. Reserved, Barbie, not for launch use. The first week was brutal. During equipment checks, they'd hand her the easiest tasks, wiping down control panels, organizing toolkits, fetching coffee for the real engineers. Barbie, can you handle this complex task of counting bolts? Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez would say, getting laughs from the crew. Valerie never reacted. She worked diligently, documenting every system error, teaching herself the coding structure of the emergency launch protocols. She volunteered for night shifts just to get time alone with the simulation systems. While others slept, she studied. The hum of machinery became her lullaby. The glow of computer screens, her reading light. She discovered something others missed. The newer systems had gaps, vulnerabilities, scenarios where only the old protocols could work. First climax moment, during a pressure failure simulation, Valerie suggested using the abandoned 47A command sequence. An older engineer scoffed, "What, you memorize systems from my grandfather's era? Maybe I should teach you how to make coffee instead. That'd be more fitting?" The room erupted in laughter. Someone whistled mockingly. Another engineer patted her shoulder condescendingly. "Stick to what you know, Barbie." Valerie just nodded, said nothing. But from that day forward, she started handwriting the entire emergency hybrid launch diagrams, taping them under her private desk drawer. She studied every night, every component, every failsafe, every backup protocol that everyone else had forgotten. The other engineers would walk past her desk, see her scribbling notes, and shake their heads. "Look at Barbie, still playing with her homework." Probably drawing pictures of ponies and rainbows. But Valerie kept going. She ran simulation after simulation in her head. She memorized pressure readings, timing sequences, backup codes that hadn't been used in years. She created her own training regimen, hand-drawn flowcharts, timing exercises, memory drills. She knew that one day when everything modern failed, someone would need to remember the old ways. What she didn't know was that day would come sooner than anyone expected. And when it did, those same people who laughed at her homework would be begging her to save a life. CTA Act 1. Ever seen someone underestimated just because of how they look? Type SOUNFAIR. Valerie wasn't allowed to participate in any official launch operations. Every morning she quietly recalibrated the launch chamber readings, documenting even the smallest discrepancies that others missed. Weeks turned into months. The mockery continued, but something else was happening. A technical officer named Miller started noticing patterns. Equipment that should have failed, didn't. Systems that should have been off by degrees ran perfectly. One morning, he caught her in the act. "Miller, did you just readjust the pressure feedback model?" "Valerie, it was off by 0.3 milliseconds. If we don't fix it, the launch angle will be off by 1.4 degrees. Miller paused. Most technicians wouldn't catch an error that small. Hell, most wouldn't even look for it. "How did you know to check for that specific error?" "Because I've read every malfunction report from the past 5 years. This error pattern shows up every 47 days when humidity exceeds 73%. Miller started getting suspicious. He checked her file and was stunned. Valerie had been valedictorian at the Naval Academy, specializing in directional propulsion systems. She'd worked as an assistant at the Emergency Rescue Launch Research Center. She'd published papers on legacy system integration. When Miller asked why she never mentioned this, she replied, "I want people to know I'm good because of what I do here." not because of a resume line. Besides, she added quietly, would it have mattered? Or would they have found other reasons to keep me off the main team? Miller had no answer for that. Then came the fateful day, October 15th, 2:47 p.m. Storm clouds gathering on the horizon. An FA-18 was making an emergency landing in rough seas. Force 8 winds. The approach vector was completely off. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio. Roosevelt Tower, I've got engine failure and hydraulic issues. Coming in hot and heavy. The emergency support launch system had to be activated, but when Chief Rodriguez tried to access it, his face went pale. The new software doesn't support the old 47A protocol, and this bird is too heavy for the standard emergency procedures. The lead technician couldn't remember the sequence. The manual was missing. The digital files had been archived. We need someone who knows the legacy systems, Rodriguez shouted. The room went quiet. These systems hadn't been used in over a decade. Most of the engineers who knew them had retired. There's got to be someone, Miller said, looking around desperately. Valerie stepped forward. I know that sequence. I have the paper commands and simulation models. An officer laughed bitterly. You've never even worked a single launch shift. Valerie's voice was calm, steady. Precisely because I wasn't allowed to work shifts, I've simulated this exact scenario 2,412 times in silence. The room fell dead silent. What did you just say? Miller asked. Every night for 8 months, I've been running emergency protocols on the backup simulator. I know every command, every timing, every possible failure point. She pulled out a worn notebook from her pocket. Hand-drawn diagrams, pressure calculations, backup sequences, pages and pages of meticulous documentation. I wrote down everything because I knew someday, when the computers failed, someone would need to remember how to do this by hand. The deputy commander looked at the notebook, then at Valerie. You've been preparing for this scenario for 8 months? Sir, I've been preparing since my first day, because when you're not allowed to be part of the main team, you become the backup plan. Outside, they could hear the roar of the struggling FA-18. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio again. Roosevelt Tower, I'm losing altitude fast. Need emergency assistance now. The clock was ticking. They had less than 2 minutes before the aircraft would be too far out to help. All eyes turned to Valerie. CTA Act 2. Ever misjudge someone completely? Type, I was wrong. The deputy commander stared at Valerie for what felt like an eternity. Rodriguez, step aside, he ordered. Give her the controls. Rodriguez hesitated. Sir, with all due respect, she's never had the chance. The commander cut him off. Today she gets it. The deputy commander gave Valerie emergency clearance. You have exactly 8 seconds to activate. If you're wrong, we lose a life. Valerie nodded, walked to the control panel. The entire room watched as she placed her hands on the controls that she'd been forbidden to touch for 8 months. No trembling, no hesitation. She began entering the manual command sequence, a protocol only used in the 2009 version of the system. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who had practiced this exact moment thousands of times. The entire operations room held its breath. Pressure nominal, she called out, her voice steady. Trajectory calculated. Wind compensation applied. Initiating 47A emergency protocol. 3.7 seconds later, the emergency support launch was activated. A pneumatic cushion system deployed toward the ocean, creating an air buffer that would allow the pilot to crash land at an angle without plunging straight down. The launch worked perfectly. The timing was flawless, but the story was just beginning. The rescue helicopter arrived just in time, pulling the pilot from the sinking aircraft wreckage. As they hauled the pilot onto the helicopter, the radio crackled. Roosevelt Tower, this is Rescue 1. Pilot is alive and conscious. Repeat, pilot is alive and conscious. The operations room erupted in cheers. Men who had mocked Valerie for months were now slapping her on the back, congratulating her. But Valerie just stood there quietly, staring at the control panel. The commander walked over, said nothing at first. He removed the sticker from her locker and handed it to her. I believe this belongs in the trash, he said. The next day, during the full unit meeting, Valerie was officially recognized. The woman you all called the Benchwarmer just saved a pilot's life because she dared to learn when nobody asked her to learn. Miller stood up and started clapping first. Slowly, the entire room joined in. Valerie remained silent. A week later, she received an email from the Naval Air Command Office. We would like to invite you to join the development team for the next generation automated rescue launch system. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. When they ran a full investigation of the incident, they discovered something remarkable. The 47A protocol that Valerie used, it had been scheduled for permanent deletion from all systems the following month. The Navy was modernizing. Old systems were being scrapped. Legacy knowledge was being archived and forgotten. If this emergency had happened just 4 weeks later, that knowledge would have been gone forever. Valerie had unknowingly preserved a critical piece of technology that the military had almost lost. But there was more. When they interviewed the pilot she saved, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, they learned something incredible. Chen wasn't just any pilot. She was actually the lead test pilot for the new automated rescue systems. Her survival meant that 3 years of research and development wouldn't be lost. The woman they called Benchwarmer Barbie didn't just save one life. She saved an entire program that would go on to rescue dozens of pilots in the years that followed. During the investigation, they also discovered something else that shocked everyone. Valerie's hobby of studying legacy systems had actually prevented 3 other potential disasters over the past 8 months. Those small calibrations she made every morning, each one had prevented what could have been catastrophic system failures. The mockery she endured hadn't just been unfair, it had been dangerous. Because while they were laughing at her, she was quietly keeping them all safe. Valerie rewrote the 47A protocol for the entire fleet with a note, "Don't let old knowledge disappear. Sometimes it saves lives." But she made one request that surprised everyone. She asked that the new systems include a manual backup mode, operated by hand with paper documentation. "Computers fail," she said, "but knowledge written by hand and stored in human memory, that's forever." CTA Act 3. If someone's quiet preparation ever saved you, type, "I owe them." Valerie declined all television interviews and speaking engagements. "I didn't do this for recognition," she told Miller when he asked why she wouldn't talk to the media. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." She only returned to USS Roosevelt 2 months each year, teaching young sailors about unofficial skills training. Her classes had one requirement: turn off all screens, write by hand, remember by feel. The first time she taught the class, only 3 people showed up. Word spread quickly. She's the one who saved that pilot using some ancient system nobody else knew. Soon her classes were packed, but Valerie kept the same intimate style. Small groups, personal attention, hands-on learning. Every year there were 1 or 2 female students, usually shy and quiet. They'd sit in the back, taking notes furiously but rarely speaking up. But Valerie always gave them special attention. Study as if one day you'll be the only one left standing. She'd pull them aside after class, share her notebooks, teach them the systems that others had forgotten. The Navy is changing, she'd tell them, but change doesn't mean throwing away everything that came before. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. On the old control panel wall, they engraved a new line, Langford 47A, 3.7 seconds, no error. Valerie never asked for a title change, but now everyone calls her Lady Launch. 3 years later, when the new automated rescue system saved its first pilot, the news report mentioned that it was based on protocols preserved by an unnamed female officer who studied forgotten systems in her spare time. Valerie watched the report from her small apartment, smiled quietly, and went back to her evening routine. She still keeps notebooks, still writes everything by hand, still practices sequences that nobody uses anymore, because she knows that someday, somewhere, someone will need to remember what everyone else forgot. The young female sailors she mentored have started their own tradition. They call themselves the Silent Squadron. They study everything. They document everything. They prepare for scenarios that don't exist yet. And when asked why, they give the same answer Valerie taught them. Because someone's life might depend on what we learned when nobody was watching. 5 years after the rescue, Valerie received a letter from Lieutenant Commander Chen, the pilot she saved. "You don't know me, but you saved my life. More than that, you showed me what real strength looks like. It's not loud, it's not flashy. It's quiet preparation meeting the moment when everything depends on being ready. Thank you for being ready when I needed you to be. CTA Act 4. Type, I'll live quietly prepared if you believe silence can save lives. Valerie Langford doesn't shout, doesn't argue. She learns, she remembers, and when the moment comes, she steps up. In a world where recognition often comes from noise, Valerie reminds us, you don't need to be seen. You just need to be right when everyone else is wrong. Today's story isn't just about technology or skills. It's about quiet determination, silent preparation, and that single moment when you're trusted to make the difference. The most powerful people aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the ones sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes while everyone else is talking. They're learning what others ignore, remembering what others forget, preparing for the day when everything falls apart and someone needs to know how to fix it. In our rush to embrace the new, we often discard the old. But Valerie understood something crucial. Innovation builds on foundation. The future depends on preserving the past. Every expert was once a beginner. Every hero was once dismissed. Every breakthrough came from someone who kept going when others gave up. If you ever get that chance to step up, be ready like your life depends on it, because someone else's life just might